Once, by order of Sultan Ibrahim III, 38 concubines accused of alleged treason were tied up and thrown from a barge into the waters of the Bosphorus. Their bodies were found only several days later, and even then, many of them were still wearing precious necklaces and silk robes. The Ottoman Sultan's harem was not a fairy tale place from Eastern legends. It was a prison, drowning in gold and marble, where every breath of a woman depended on the whim of one man. Behind massive gates, guarded by eunuchs with curved yataghans, there was a world in which beauty often became a death sentence. The girls were brought here by force. They were selected from conquered lands in the Balkans, Greece, the Caucasus, Crimea, Persia. Some ended up in the harem after attacks on villages, others through slave traders. Those who arrived were stripped naked and examined like goods. They checked their teeth, skin, breast shape, hip structure. They could even measure their toes. It was believed that graceful feet increased the value of a concubine. Those who did not pass the inspection disappeared without a trace. The chosen ones were sent to the harem school, a place where they were taught not only music, dance, and the art of love conversations, but also absolute obedience. The ability to remain silent when ordered and to smile when you wanted to cry was no less important than beauty. There was a ruthless hierarchy within the harem. At the top was the Valid Sultan, the ruler's mother. Below was the Haseki, the main favorite, whose influence could extend even to the empire's politics. The rest were merely participants in an endless struggle for the Sultan's attention. Victory in this struggle brought power and luxury, while defeat could cost lives. The Sultan's nightly elections were like a game of dice with fate. Sometimes he would order dozens of girls to be brought to his chambers at once and arrange humiliating tests. There were cases when concubines were forced to dance naked in icy courtyards until they fell from the cold. Other times, women were locked in scorching baths, watching who could withstand the heat longer than others. The losers were never seen again. Ibrahim was particularly cruel. Historians wrote that he once ordered several concubines to be fattened to monstrous weights so that, as he said, he could enjoy their softness. These women could barely move, but they were forced to appear in his chambers and carry out humiliating orders. Rumors in the harem were deadly. A single whisper could kill. Under Murad IV, a concubine suspected of sympathy for one of the eunuchs was taken to the inner garden, where her own hair was wrapped around her neck and she was strangled. Some punishments were not immediate but drawn out to maintain the appearance of order. A woman might be sent to a dark room, a tiny windowless room where she would sit in complete darkness and silence until she went mad. Sultans treated concubines as living decorations, and their appearance could be changed at the whim of the ruler. They could have their eyebrows and hair shaved, their teeth reshaped with files, tattooed or branded to emphasize their belonging to the Sultan. Sometimes they were forced to wear heavy gold belts, so massive that they left bloody marks on their skin. Outside the harem, women were never seen without armed guards. Even a walk in the garden turned into a ceremony in which they were more exhibits than people. Any attempt to escape ended in torture. The chronicles describe a case where a fugitive who returned from behind the walls had the Sultan's name carved into her shoulder blades before her execution. The harem was a trap from which there was no escape. The women lived in a golden cage, where marble walls and silk pillows concealed constant fear. And although from the outside, this world seemed the epitome of luxury, inside, it was an arena for the most sophisticated humiliations and cruelties that absolute power could engender. The harem, whatever it may have seemed from the outside, was a place where the Sultan's entertainment often turned into public torture. Many of these games were carefully planned, and some were born from the ruler's sudden whims, which those around him did not dare to contradict. Women here were not people, but figures on a chessboard, and any of them could become part of a spectacle that ended in death. One of the most terrifying entertainments were the so-called floating executions. By order of the Sultan, women were placed in small boats without oars and taken to the open waters of the Bosphorus. The boat was lightly set on fire at the edges to make the concubines rush around inside, scream, and try to scoop out the water with their hands. No one was in a hurry to save them. They died either from fire or from drowning. Often, a narrow circle of courtiers were invited to such executions, and the spectacle was presented as a kind of night show. Another form of torture was the bath ordeal. Women were led into a hammam heated to the limit. Inside, they were left completely alone, with with small jugs of cold water, which were not enough to cool them down. The door was locked with a massive bolt, and the guards only occasionally looked through a small window to make sure that the game was continuing. In such conditions, the skin began to crack, the hair fell out, and even those who survived never returned to their previous appearance. Particularly cruel was the peacock game described in the chronicles of the time of Sultan Mehmed III. By order of the ruler, a huge, specially trained peacock with sharp metal tips on its claws was released into the hall. Women, naked to the waist, were forced to run around the hall, dodging the bird's attacks. The peacock tore the skin, leaving deep scratches. The goal was to test the agility and courage of the concubines, but for most it ended with bloody wounds and subsequent disappearance from the harem. Punishments were often exemplary. During the reign of Sultan Murad IV, a concubine caught passing a note to another prisoner of the harem was taken to the central courtyard, tied to a marble column, and kept in the scorching sun for a whole day without water or shade. By evening, her skin was burned to bloody blisters. After that, she was never seen among the living. Sultans knew how to humiliate their concubines even in small things. They could order their favorite to spend the night kneeling at the head of his bed, holding a heavy box of jewelry in her hands. As a sign of devotion, the slightest movement or fall of the box was followed by severe punishment, from flogging to exile to a dark room. Some executions were staged with particular luxury to emphasize the Sultan's power. At the court of Ibrahim the Bursar, there is a case described in which 3 concubines were accused of witchcraft. They were dressed in expensive clothes, put on golden masks, and then, in front of the entire harem, tied up and thrown into a well covered with rose petals. This sophisticated scene was presented as a cleansing of evil, but in fact, it was a theatrical murder. The harem also practiced isolation as a form of torture. A woman could be locked in a tiny room with no windows or light for weeks, given only bread and water. In complete silence, she gradually lost her sense of time, hearing, and reason. When the isolation ended, many were unable to speak or recognize other concubines. Another cruel custom was the loyalty test. The Sultan could send a girl to the chambers of a high-ranking vizier with the order to seduce him. If the vizier gave in, he was punished, and the concubine was executed for betrayal. If the vizier resisted, the concubine returned to the harem, but often with her health undermined. After all, she was treated as bait, not a person. Despite all this, women did not dare to show open discontent. Even a quiet cry could be considered a sign of disobedience. The eunuchs responsible for order had the right to beat a concubine or put her in chains on the mere suspicion of breaking the rules. The diaries of European ambassadors admitted to Topkapi contained descriptions of how women with bruises, whip marks, or fresh scars could be found in the courtyards of the harem. Every morning in the harem began with fear. The women did not know who would be summoned to the Sultan today for mercy or for execution. And this fear was not abstract. It was as tangible as the cold of the marble slabs under their bare feet when they were led into the unknown. The history of the harem often seems faceless, a collection of cruel traditions and rules. But behind each tradition were living women with names, memories, hopes, and fears. They spoke different languages, wore different clothes, sang different songs, until they found themselves behind the walls of Topkapi, where they were stripped of everything except one role, concubine. Aishi was brought here from Tabriz at the age of 16. She was the daughter of a carpet merchant, could read and write, and knew Persian poetry. Her beauty and refined manners quickly attracted the attention of the Sultan's confidants, and soon she found herself among the chosen ones. The first months seemed like a luxurious fairy tale to her. Silk robes, sweets that she had not seen in childhood, spacious chambers filled with the smell of rose oil. But the illusions soon dissipated. One day, Aishi was subjected to a test of loyalty. The Sultan, having heard from one of the senior concubines that the girl was allegedly too cold, ordered her to be left overnight in a hot hammam without water. By morning, she had lost consciousness and her skin was covered in burns. Aishi survived, but her health was undermined. A few weeks later, she was taken out into the courtyard, where a closed audience with the Sultan took place, after which she disappeared. The servants whispered that her body had been thrown into a well. Maria of Rhodes was a fisherman's daughter. She was kidnapped by Ottoman corsairs and sold into the harem. Blue-eyed and golden-haired, she became a rare pearl in the eyes of the Sultan. But her meteoric rise aroused the envy and hatred of other women. One evening, when the Sultan was absent, she was accused of having relations with a eunuch. No evidence was required. The accusation was already a sentence. By order of the Valid Sultan, Maria was taken out into the garden. Her hands were tied to a marble pillar, leaving her overnight in the rain and cold wind. In the morning, she was lifeless. She was buried right in the garden to avoid noise in the city. Harem from Circassia was bought from a slave trader for a huge sum. She stood out for her proud character and could not hide her inflexibility. The Sultan initially found this amusing, but soon pride began to be perceived as insolence. At one of the feasts, when the concubines were forced to dance naked to the waist, Harem refused. This silent disobedience became a death sentence. She was not executed immediately. First sent to a dark room for 3 weeks, given only a piece of bread and water every 2 days. When she was taken out, she could barely stand on her feet. She was forced to appear before the Sultan, but instead of submissive words, she fell unconscious. After that, her name disappeared from the records of the harem. The chronicles also mention cases where entire groups of concubines died in one night. Sometimes this happened at the whim of the Sultan, sometimes because of intrigue. Under one ruler, 15 women were accused of witchcraft simply because one of them was found to have an amulet. They were taken to the shore of the Bosphorus, tied with one long chain and thrown into the water. Another tragedy occurred under Selim II, who organized a contest. The concubines had to run along a long hall, strewn with sharp shells and small glass. Those who fell received deep cuts, but had to continue. The winner received a necklace, but most of the participants disappeared from the harem the next day. The women lived in constant anxiety. During the day, they smiled, played in the garden, sang, but the smile could turn into fear in a second. At night, the doors of the chambers opened without knocking, and this could mean an invitation to the Sultan or arrest. The eunuchs who accompanied the women never explained where they were being taken. Some returned in the morning, some never again. There was no personal safety within these walls. Even a whisper in a corner or a sideways glance could be interpreted as disobedience. Eunuchs had the right to beat or chain a woman on mere suspicion. The diaries of European ambassadors admitted to the palace are full of descriptions of concubines with fresh bruises, whip marks, and deep scars. To the outside world, the harem was a symbol of luxury, beauty, and mystery. But for the women inside, it was a place where every day could be their last. Here they died quietly, without witnesses, and without the right to remember. The harem in Topkapi was not a chaotic gathering of women, but a clearly structured system where each person had their place, and any deviation from the rules was punished harshly. Everything was arranged here so that the concubines could not act independently, could not communicate without supervision, and even more so, dream of escape. The main figure in the harem was the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. She controlled not only the concubines, but also the eunuchs, directed the distribution of duties, and, if she wanted, could condemn any woman to death with one word. Her power was absolute. She determined who would have access to the Sultan and who would spend their lives in distant chambers, never seeing him. Under her stood the senior concubines, experienced and devoted servants of the system, who monitored order among the younger ones. They knew how to smile when talking to newcomers, and at the same time, they did not hesitate to report them if they saw inappropriate behavior. The chief eunuch, the black eunuch, Aga, was the eyes and ears of the Sultan. He knew everything that happened behind the marble walls, and his word could send a woman either to the master's chambers or to the dark room. Eunuchs were the only men allowed in the harem, and they were the ones who delivered the concubines to the Sultan. Their role was not limited to guarding. They watched every movement, listened to conversations, checked letters, and the women's personal belongings. Lists of all the concubines were kept in their chambers, with detailed descriptions of their appearance, origin, and behavior. The control system worked without failures. The harem was divided into several zones, each of which had its own doors with locks, behind which guards were on duty. Women could not freely move from one zone to another. Even walks in the garden took place according to a schedule and only under the supervision of eunuchs. Any delay or deviation from the route aroused suspicion. Letters and gifts were forbidden. If a concubine tried to secretly pass a note or an object outside the harem, she faced severe punishment. According to surviving chronicles, one woman caught with a piece of paper wrapped in her hair was tied up and kept on her knees for 3 days, not allowing her to sit or lie down. By the end of the 3rd day, she had lost consciousness and died of exhaustion. Even sleep was not free time. Eunuchs could enter the chambers at any time of the night to make sure the women were in their places. Sometimes they were woken suddenly and lined up for inspection. Their appearance, hair, clean nails, the absence of bruises or scars that could indicate secret meetings. Any deviation from the ideal image could be cause for investigation and therefore punishment. An important part of the system was the division of concubines into groups based on their level of access to the sultan. At the lowest level were women who served in the kitchen or baths. They rarely saw the ruler and were often victims of bullying from their elders. Above them were those who participated in feasts and performances but had no personal contact with the sultan. At the top of the pyramid were the favorites. Their number was limited, and each of them lived in constant fear of losing her place. There were also unspoken punishments in the harem that were not written down in the official rules. A woman could be deprived of food, locked in a room without light for several days, forced to stand in a cold courtyard barefoot until her feet went numb from the frost. Sometimes the punishment took on a demonstrative character. One of the concubines, suspected of stealing jewelry, was forced to wear a heavy iron chain around her neck for a whole month so that everyone could see her guilt. Public humiliation occupied a special place. There were cases when the sultan, dissatisfied with the behavior of a woman, ordered her to be dressed in a torn dress and put in the central hall for the whole day so that everyone else could look at her. Such punishments broke women no less than physical pain, because in the closed world of the harem, reputation meant everything. All these measures created an atmosphere in which the idea of resistance seemed unthinkable. Any attempt to violate the established order resulted in brutal reprisals, and the other concubines became witnesses to the punishment so that the fear would take root deeper. The system worked like a perfect suppression machine, without failures and without mercy. In this world, women ceased to be individuals. They were turned into elements of the palace mechanism that served the whims of one man. And the stronger the walls of Topkapi were, the harder it was to notice that behind the marble shine, there was a world where life and death were decided in a second. There was no happy old age in the harem. Even those few women who managed to live there for decades left its walls broken and useless. The fate of a concubine depended on one thing: the favor of the sultan. As soon as it faded, life could change overnight. For most, the journey ended in the so-called houses of seclusion, special buildings where women who had lost their appeal or the ruler's interest were sent. These houses were surrounded by high walls, behind which the former concubines spent the rest of their days in boredom and poverty. They were given a small allowance, barely enough for food. Many died there alone, unmourned, their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside the city. It was worse for those who fell into disgrace. Sultans, especially hot-tempered ones, did not tolerate even the slightest hint of disobedience. A woman suspected of treason or secret intrigues disappeared without a trace. The chronicles mention concubines who were taken outside Istanbul at night, where they were drowned in wells or buried in the sand on the shores of the Sea of Marmara. These executions were always carried out in silence without witnesses, but the morning whispers among those who remained filled the harem with a new round of fear. Sometimes women were exiled to distant provinces, supposedly as a reward to marry loyal pashas or officials. In reality, this was often just another form of punishment. The concubine who was married off ended up in the house of another man without the right to refuse and lived in complete dependence on his will. Many of these marriages turned into life imprisonment, only in a different cage. Escapes were almost impossible. The harem was guarded no worse than the state treasuries, but rare attempts did happen. One of the letters of the French consul of the early 17th century describes a case when a concubine, dressed as a servant, tried to leave through the kitchen courtyard. She was caught in the second courtyard of the palace. The Sultan ordered that the execution be made demonstrative. The woman was taken out several times during the day to different parts of the harem, chained so that everyone could see her fate. In the evening, she was drowned in a garden pond. Even those who managed to live for years in the Sultan's favor rarely left of their own free will. More often, they were simply replaced by young and beautiful ones. Older favorites could be transferred to the rank of servants to the Valid Sultan, which was perceived as humiliation because only yesterday they shared a bed with the ruler and today they served water or combed the hair of another woman. Particular cruelty was demonstrated during periods of change of power. The new sultan almost always cleared the harem of his predecessor's women. Some were sold, others were sent to distant harems of provincial palaces, and others were killed to eliminate possible sources of influence. Thus, after the death of Murad III, dozens of concubines were sent outside the capital, and 6 women accused of conspiracies disappeared that same night. Some of those who survived the harem years lived to old age, but they carried deep traumas. European travelers who managed to meet former concubines described them as women with empty eyes, speaking in a quiet, cautious voice, as if every phrase could cost them their lives. Many did not know how to live, except by the rules hammered into them by years of fear and submission. In rare cases, a concubine could leave the harem with a rich dowry if the sultan particularly valued her. But even then, she remained forever linked to this past. Her name, history, and body already belonged to the court, and in people's memories she remained a woman from the harem, even if she built a new life far from the capital. This is how the journey of most ended. Not loudly, not brightly, but quietly, in the shadow of marble walls, where their youth and life were given over to the whim of one man. And even beyond Topkapi, these walls continued to live in their memory as a symbol of a cage from which there is no escape.